These lectures are part of the Great Courses. The Great Courses cover a broad array of university-level disciplines. The lectures in each course are either 30 or 45 minutes long. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalog or website at thegreatcourses.com and imagine how much you could learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the best college classrooms in the world. The lecturers are university professors carefully selected by the Great Courses and its customers for intellectual distinction and teaching excellence. These lectures are titled Great Minds of the Eastern Intellectual Tradition. The lecturer is Professor Grant Hardy. Dr. Hardy is a professor of history and religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He is the director of the Humanities program and served 2 terms as chair of the History Department. He has a BA in Ancient Greek from Brigham Young University and a PhD in Chinese Language and Literature from Yale University. Dr. Hardy wrote Worlds of Bronze and Bamboo, Sima Qian's Conquest of History, and co-edited the first volume of the Oxford History of Historical Writing. His other books include The Establishment of the Han Empire and Imperial China, co-authored with Ann Kinney, and Understanding the Book of Mormon. Professor Hardy won UNC Asheville's 2002 Distinguished Teacher Award for the Arts and Humanities faculty and was named to a Ruth and Leon Feldman Professorship for 2009-2010. He has participated in scholarly symposia on Sima Qian and early Chinese historiography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Harvard University, and the University of Heidelberg. He also received a research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Raised in Northern California, Professor Hardy also lived in Taiwan for 2 years and has taught at Brigham Young University, BYU Hawaii, and Elmira College. The course guidebook that comes with these lectures includes lecture guides, a timeline, and a bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to review these materials before or after each lecture. Lecture 1. Life's Great Questions. Asian Perspectives.
Hello, I'm Professor Grant Hardy from the University of North Carolina at Asheville. It's a pleasure to be with you. And that's not just polite talk. I'm thrilled to be here. 20 years ago, I bought the first edition of the lecture series Great Minds of the Western Intellectual Tradition. Since I was teaching Chinese history at the time, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was something like this for the Eastern intellectual tradition as well? And that's what we're here for. Our first task in this introduction is to set some basic parameters so you know what to expect from this course. I'll make a few comments about the content and scope of what will happen, the where, the what, the who, and the when, along with some of the challenges that will arise. And then we'll look at 2 significant questions. Is there such a thing as the Eastern intellectual tradition? And second, why would this matter to people in the West today? Okay. On the where, we'll be doing 36 lectures about Asia. So that's India, China, and Japan, with a few side trips to Persia, Tibet, and Korea. Now, there was certainly intelligent thought and rich cultural development in the Americas and in Africa, but Asia is the one place, aside from Europe and the Near East, that has a long written record of intellectual speculation and analysis. I mean, like 1,000 years or more. The what? We're not just doing Asian philosophy. In the West, and particularly within the last few centuries, the term philosophy has taken on a rather restricted meaning. It's a critical examination of fundamental questions of existence, values, knowledge, and language based on a systematic, rational argument. So in contemporary universities, we sharply distinguish between the disciplines of philosophy from religion, from politics, literature, history, psychology, and science. I mean, each of those has a different academic department. Those distinctions, though, don't really hold up in the pre-modern West, and they are certainly foreign to Asian thought. So we'll be doing a little of all of those. Because this course will cover great minds from a number of disciplines, it might be useful to think of what we're doing in terms of the original definition of the Greek word philosophy, philosophia. It's the love of wisdom. Now, the who. I will be introducing you to several dozen major figures in Asian intellectual history, and I'll highlight those figures that seem to have the most influence within their own culture. Over and over, you'll hear me say, this is one of the most important thinkers in Asian history, and that will always be true. Okay. Construct a little mental list of your own of famous thinkers from Western intellectual history. You might think of Moses and Aristotle and Jesus and Aquinas and Machiavelli and Shakespeare, Newton, Adam Smith, Marx, Freud, Einstein. Okay, and all of those are pretty familiar to you. We'll be doing something similar in this course, but we'll be talking about Asian figures that you would know pretty well had you grown up in those regions. Now, the when. We're going to cover a long time span, beginning with the anonymous writers of the Indian Vedas about 1200 BC, and then continuing on with foundational figures such as Buddha and Confucius around 500 BC. So we'll have 8 lectures on the origins of Asian intellectual history. And then we'll have 10 lectures on the development of major intellectual traditions in the age of early empires in India and China, and then also Persia and Japan. And then we'll have 10 lectures on great minds of the medieval era. Okay, that term is borrowed from Western history. It doesn't exactly work in Asia, but it's convenient. So in this medieval period, we'll see how these cultural traditions mix as ideas move from India to China, and then up to Tibet, and then from China to Korea and Japan. And then we'll end that section with a survey lecture on science and technology in pre-modern Asia. We'll finish the course with 7 lectures on the modern era, while I'll introduce thinkers who were instrumental in integrating Western ideas into Asian traditions, as well as Asian scholars who first introduced their own intellectual heritage to Western audiences. And then that will take us in the 20th century, where we'll be talking about people like Mahatma Gandhi and Mao Zedong. So we're going to bounce back and forth a little across timelines as we track developments in one region before we move to the next. So a little bit in India, and then we'll come to China, we'll backtrack and go again. But I'll help you keep the times and the places straight. As we go through this, you'll be aware of 3 challenges. The first is what to do about Islam, which begins in the Near East and then spreads through North Africa, but it also reaches into Asia as well. From the perspective of this course, Islam is a Western religion, with its emphasis on the one true God who created the world, right? It's monotheistic, actually the same God that's worshipped by Jews and Christians. And this God will someday judge the souls of men and women and then consign them either to paradise or to hell for eternity. In fact, Islam is an important part of the Western intellectual tradition, with Muslim thinkers playing major roles in the preservation and the propagation of Greek ideas and philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. But it's worth remembering that there are 3 times as many Muslims living today in Asia as live in the Middle East, all put together. And in particular, Bangladesh and Pakistan, India, and Indonesia have huge populations of Muslims, especially Indonesia. I will assume that you already know something about Muhammad and the religion he founded, and we'll pick up the story of Islamic thought as it spreads eastward through Persia and then into South Asia. The second challenge that we have will be Asian names and terms. Okay, there's just no way to get around this. And Sanskrit, Chinese, and Japanese are all difficult languages, and they don't sound much like English. I'll try not to pile on too many of these foreign words, and I'll sometimes spell them out as I speak. But names are inescapable in a course about great thinkers. And there are sometimes multiple English spellings for the same people in China and in India. For example, Sima Qian, the great historian in Han Dynasty China. His name is spelled S-I-M-A, Sima, Q-I-A-N, Qian. So the Q sounds something like an English CH sound. There are actually 2 romanizations for Chinese, which is why Taoism is sometimes spelled with a T and sometimes spelled with a D. It's always pronounced Taoism with a D, but there were some linguistic reasons why they used the T earlier. Okay, don't worry, I'll help you through all that. Furthermore, in China and Japan, the family name comes before the given name. So Sima Qian's father is named Sima Tan. Sima is the family name. But this is part of what makes a course like this sort of interesting. Just different ways of thinking about how the world comes together. Wherever I can, I'll try to work in names and terms that may already be familiar to you. So we'll talk about Confucius and Buddha, of course, but also yoga, karma, guru, mandala, nirvana, yin and yang, Gandhi, the Dalai Lama. I'll put each of those thinkers and ideas into their historic context. And then at the end of the course, you'll have a good overview of how they all fit together. The third challenge will be the sheer amount of material that we're covering. Okay, prepare for meaning of life overload. We'll be looking at several major religious and philosophical traditions, all of which have long, rich histories of debate and elaboration and commentaries on commentaries sometimes, as they're thinking about the nature of the universe, how we should live, and what life is for. It's important, though, that we talk about the leading figures all along the way, because intellectual history is cumulative rather than displacive. So if you're taking a course in physics, you don't care that much about Galileo. We have new theories that work better than that. In the humanities, in Asian intellectual history, Confucius and the Buddha still matter greatly all the way through. So we'll go back to the well again and again, just as people in these traditions do. Many of these traditions organize their basic insights into lists, and you're going to hear a lot of those. So there's the 8 this, and there's the 4 that. Okay, don't just tune those out. They matter. Asian thinkers use lists partly because they're generally working within an oral tradition, and they're easier to memorize. I mean, these are lists that were taught to students. And lists are also attempts, worked out over time, to be clear and comprehensive. So they provide sort of road markers for spiritual or intellectual progress. A lot of wisdom goes in those quick lists that I'll just tick off. I'll try to give them to you a couple times so you can catch it as we're going. We're just going to hit the highlights in this course, but you still may feel a bit overwhelmed by the time you get to lecture 36. That's okay. It's a lot to digest, and you can listen to the course over again. This will give you a good overview, a comprehensive sweep through Eastern intellectual history. And if you're interested in learning more about it, it will provide a solid foundation for further study. Which brings me to the first of my 2 big questions. Is there an Eastern intellectual tradition? And the official answer is, sort of. I'm going to take a quick detour here. Just a couple of steps from my bed is a small bookshelf containing the 60 volumes of the great books of the Western world. Okay. I know the criticisms of this set, that it focuses nearly exclusively on dead white males, that many important works were left out, that they could really use commentaries or introductions. But I still really like these books. It's a handy collection of the kind of books that I enjoy reading, and I'm always in the middle of 1 or 2, regardless of whatever else I'm working on. I don't know that I'll ever make it through the whole set, but it seems like a privilege to listen in to what Robert Hutchins, one of the founders of the Great Books Project, called The Great Conversation. These are books that have been tremendously influential in shaping the world that we live in, even if people don't read them too much anymore. But our common ideas, our assumptions, our cultural conventions, they come from somewhere. Often they come from these thinkers, and I'm curious about the origins of that. If we can discover the origins of our mental furniture, then we're free to argue with those thinkers, and we can deliberately choose what we will or won't accept into our minds. Remember what Socrates famously said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think of that every morning as I wake up and see those 2 shelves of cute matching volumes. It makes the history of the West look compact and handleable and inviting. But because I teach Chinese history, I also wonder if there couldn't be a matching set called Great Books of the Eastern World that similarly offered a compact but relatively comprehensive window into the origins and development of Eastern thought. I'm not sure that this would be a bestseller, but it would still be fun for some of us. Nevertheless, the results wouldn't be quite the same. A case can be made that there's a Western intellectual tradition, in the sense that nearly all of the writers knew about both their contemporaries and then also about their predecessors. They read the earlier books in the set, and many of them were responding to or criticizing what previous thinkers had said. As the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once remarked, with just a little exaggeration, European philosophy, he said, consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. That's not the case with Asian thought. There's an intellectual tradition there, but it's more diffuse and fragmented than a shelf of books or even a long-running conversation. So let me give you an extended analogy. Imagine that you're in a big city with 3 major convention centers, and there are 3 large conferences that are all going on at the same time. The first center will represent India, and we'll put it at the Darshana Hotel. Darshana is a Sanskrit word that originally meant to see or to view, but then eventually it came to mean understanding or insight, particularly insight into the nature of reality. And it's a common term to refer to Indian philosophies. They're darshanas. But those philosophies usually include some notion of salvation, so they have religious overtones. Remember that religion and philosophy are sort of bound together in Asian history, oftentimes, especially in India. So, in this conference, it begins with a plenary session on the Vedas. That is this collection of ancient hymns, and then the Upanishads, which are some later texts that explore some of the key ideas in the Veda. Ideas about samsara, which is reincarnation, karma, which is justice, and moksha, or liberation. Eventually, the audience breaks into smaller groups, and then the 6 orthodox darshanas, the philosophical schools in India, all argue with each other, and they refine their ideas as they argue on rational, logical grounds. Now, there are also 2 groups who are at this conference who entirely reject the principles laid out in the first session. That is, they reject the authority of the Brahmin priests and the Vedas, the sacred texts that they were associated with. So these 2 subgroups break out into their own sessions. And these are the Jains and the Buddhists. And then occasionally, Zoroastrian and Muslim visitors will wander in and join in the conversation. Okay, a little while after things get started at the Darshana Hotel, another convention center begins hosting a second meeting. So we'll call this the Dao Hotel, since this is going to be in China. Dao, as you may know, is a Chinese word that means a path or a road, though it's usually translated in philosophical contexts as the way with a capital W, the Tao. We often associate this term, Tao, with Taoists. I mean, that makes sense, right? But all the Chinese schools of thought, beginning with Confucius, claim to teach about the way. In fact, there's a great book on Chinese philosophy entitled Disputers of the Tao. Everybody wanted to tell you about the way. Now, at this conference, this is in China now, there are some differences with what we saw back in India. There isn't a caste system. Chinese thinkers tend to be aspiring government officials, and the discussions are more focused on the problems of this world rather than on metaphysics or on concerns about the next life or lives, as the case may be. But the debates in the Tao Hotel are just as vocal and lively. There are Confucians and Taoists and legalists and Moists and naturalists and logicians. We're going to talk about all these people, and they're all arguing about the Tao. Now, some people say that the true way is the path trod by ancient sage kings, while others argue, no. The real way is the way of nature, and so forth. There's a practical dimension to the Tao. Chinese philosophers are not just interested in describing the world accurately and making their definitions very keen and concrete. They're engaged in providing guidelines on how we should live. Okay, the word Tao, which means path, it's meant to be followed. It's like you would walk along a path. And then that brings us to the third convention, which will stand in for Japan. Now, this is a more recent organization, and it's just getting started. So they sent some people over to the Tao Hotel to see how they have arranged things there. And the participants at this third conference, we're in Japan, right, have their own set of political and cultural concerns. But they begin as an affiliate of the second group. So we'll put them in the Do Hotel. Do is the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese word Tao. It's actually the same written character, same meaning. But in Japanese, they often borrow Chinese characters. They call them kanji there, and use them as part of their written language. And we'll see that a lot of Japanese thought starts in China. Not all of it, but a great deal of it does. Okay. In this Do Hotel in Japan, it's a smaller gathering, and the attendees end up arguing about issues of particular interest to themselves on their own terms. But there are always a few people who are going from the Do Hotel back to the Tao Hotel, and then they see what's going on there, and they bring back ideas and training manuals. even though most of the participants in the Dao Hotel aren't paying much attention to what's happening at Convention Center number 3. Okay, one more set of connections. There's a particularly active subgroup at the Darshana Hotel, and these are the Buddhists. Some of them make their way to the Dao Hotel, right in China, and strike up conversations with the folks there, starting with the Taoists, naturally enough. They manage to attract enough people to their side of the auditorium that eventually the other speakers who are speaking in the Dao Hotel start to adapt their pitches to respond to Buddhist concerns. We'll see that with Neo-Confucianism. Over time, the Buddhists make their way to the Do Hotel as well in Japan, where they become very popular. In the meantime, there are almost no Buddhists left back at the Darshana Hotel. This is a fascinating turn of events that has to do with the development of Hinduism and with the arrival of Islam in India. But Buddhism basically dies out in the land of its birth in India. So now we can return to the question, is there an Asian intellectual tradition? Not if we're thinking about a single conversation. Indian scholars don't know much about Chinese thought, and vice versa. Although Chinese ideas are very well known in Japan, Japanese thinkers are not discussed very much in China. But everyone argues with the Buddhists, so indirectly, Chinese and Japanese intellectuals do receive some influence from Indian thought. So one way to think about this is to imagine two relatively distinct great conversations. There's one focused in India and the other in China, and then considerable overlap into Japan and Korea, with Buddhists moving all the way through Asia, and actually even up into Tibet, where Buddhism will be central to Tibetan thought. In the lectures that follow, we'll be jumping from one civilization to another civilization, but there are some connecting threads, and as we move through the course, you'll see more and more interaction between these different regions in Asia. Which leads us to the next question. Why might this matter to Westerners today? I've got several answers. The first one is that it's interesting. I'm always intrigued by how different life has been at other times and in other places. It's fascinating to study intelligent, thoughtful people who have conceptualized their lives in ways that are quite foreign to our own cultural assumptions. And we'll see several examples of significant ancient texts that were rediscovered in the 20th century. So the conversation keeps going. The second reason to study the Eastern intellectual tradition is that it's useful. Now that may be a bit of a surprise, but let me explain. It's something of a cliche to say that the world is getting smaller, but it's one of those true cliches. Today, the West is deeply connected to Asia through politics and the economy. I mean, you've probably encountered Asian companies, Asian products, or people at your work. You may have friends from Asia, you may have neighbors or family members. You yourself may have an Asian origin at some point in your genealogy. Or you may have traveled to China and to Japan. In any of those situations, you probably notice some cultural differences. A course like this can help people better understand each other. The ancient Stoic philosophers used to speak of being cosmopolitan, which literally means a citizen of the world. If you don't know something about Asian history and philosophy and religion and literature, you're missing a great deal of our world, actually a great deal of what defines the human condition. And you won't really know much about the planet as a whole, the one that you live in. So it's important to understand our own Western intellectual tradition, to know where we're coming from, but that's not enough anymore. Let me give you a third answer as to why we should care about this. And that has to do with the meaning of life. Okay, I know it's unfashionable these days to care about the big issues of meaning and existence, but they are as important as ever. All of us have choices to make as to how to spend our time, what our priorities should be, what matters most in life. And you can just sort of fall into conventional ways of living. You know, you can do what other people are doing, you can do what you see on TV, you can just continue what you grew up with, or you can investigate things deliberately. What we'll find in the next 35 lectures is that in many ways, Eastern thought is different, but it's not particularly mysterious or exotic. In fact, Asian thinkers are interested in the same sorts of questions that have engaged philosophers in the West. Again and again in this course, we'll come back to 5 basic questions. You ready? First, what is the nature of reality? Does it include a God? What happens after we die? Okay. Second, basic question, how do we know what we know? It's kind of an odd question. How do we know what we know? What counts as evidence? What's the nature of language, and how does that help or hinder communication? The third question, how should society be organized? What's the proper role for government? How should people treat each other? What makes for a successful family? The fourth big question, why do people suffer? We see so much pain and sorrow around us. Where does that come from? And can it be stopped? And then fifth and last, how can we find happiness? It's a question worth thinking a lot about. How can we find happiness? How should we live our lives? What's worth spending our time on? Now, some of you may be seekers. You may still be looking to answers to life's great questions. And if you're interested, you can actually become a Buddhist. I mean, you can convert, or you can take up yoga, or you can adopt Confucian values, or you can devote your life to Japanese art. These are living traditions. Probably more of you, however, have already decided basically what you believe in politically or religiously and how you'll spend your life. I'm actually in that category. I'm pretty secure in my own religious beliefs and my social values. In fact, I'm an outsider to all of the traditions that I'll be talking about. I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not Hindu, I'm not Confucian, yet my life has been immeasurably enriched by engaging with Eastern thought. Sometimes my ideas have been challenged and I've been forced to refine what I believe or to think about things from another perspective. On other occasions, I've adopted some aspects of Asian thought into my own worldview. Let me give you a quick example. One day, as I was translating Chinese, I came across the phrase Wang Nian Jiao, which was defined in the dictionary as a friendship in which the difference in age between the friends is forgotten. Okay. Literally, the phrase means a forget the years friendship. Okay. That was a new concept. I'd never heard of it before. But once I thought of it in that way, I started to categorize all the friendships that I knew. And that term fit some of them. I'd even been in some relationships like that myself, where there was a difference in age and it really didn't matter so much. And once I learned that phrase, Wang Nian Jiao, this forget the age friendships, once I had a word for it, then I started to notice those particular friendships. And I realized what a wonderful gift they can be. Let me give you just one more example. I learned Chinese when I was living for a couple of years in Taiwan. And you learn Chinese, as with any language, by speaking it as much as possible. You make lots of mistakes, and gradually you get better. But you need to talk with people. And I discovered that as I was out and about, if I saw a Chinese mother and some children, I learned how to say in Chinese, "Your children are really cute," which is just a great sort of conversation starter. But to my surprise, when I would say, "Oh, your child is very cute," Chinese mothers would invariably say, "Who, this child? This child is ugly and ignorant and naughty, never does what I say." And at first, I was pretty shocked by this when it seemed to be a pattern. I thought, we're going to have a whole nation of children who grow up with poor self-esteem. But that isn't really how it works, because all Chinese mothers talk about their children in the same way. So any individual child doesn't feel picked on or set apart from his friends. So it doesn't have that same edge to it. But also, it comes from Confucian notions of politeness. That what you need to do is to disparage what's your own and then praise what's someone else's. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you try this at home. In America, if you tell other people that your children are ignorant and ugly, people are not going to understand. Your children are going to feel terrible about this. But in a Chinese Confucian culture, it works. There's a certain wisdom, a graciousness about being modest about one's own abilities, one's own accomplishments and family, and then being generous with regard to what is someone else's. I know it sort of goes against American cultural values. When I came back to America from Taiwan after 2 years there, I had a reverse cultural shock. I mean, it was sort of amazing how rude and arrogant Americans were about everything was great that they did. So I had sort of adapted to this more Chinese mode of politeness. In a similar fashion, when I would practice my Chinese and try to work on it, Chinese people would always say, "Your Chinese is great," even though I knew that it was terrible, and I knew that they knew that it was terrible, but it kept us talking. So in this course, we're going to keep talking about the Eastern intellectual tradition. Because we're outsiders for the most part, we're going to be generous and appreciative of how things are there. I'm going to try to present these ideas in the best light possible. There may be some room later on for some critical approaches, but to begin with, I want you to be able to see these traditions as people from the inside who grew up with them, for whom they seem natural and regular would see them, and who love these traditions. I want you to learn to love these traditions, at least to some extent, to know what they're like, and then we can see from there what parts might be useful for you, what might feel comfortable, what you may want to incorporate into your own life and into your own thought patterns. It will all begin with the Indian Vedas. And so that's where we will start in the next lecture. I'll see you then.